Okay, we're going to start with paragraphs 1 and 2 of the TREC 1 to 4 family contract. So Kim, what does paragraph 1 mean?
So paragraph 1, when you are writing the contract and putting in the seller's information, it's however they took title in the property, which is usually on the tax records.
Okay.
And then the buyer, you ask them how they want to take title at closing, and that's how you put their names in on the contract.
Perfect. And if you look at the tax record and you see someone's name on there that is not affiliated with the transaction, or you don't know to be affiliated with the transaction, what should you do?
Red flag, talk to the listing brokerage.
Okay, there you go. And if we are the listing brokerage, do your research. And if you don't know how to do it, come and see us, right?
Come see us, absolutely.
All right, perfect. So let's go to paragraph number 2. This one, people can sometimes get lost in the weeds a little bit on paragraph 2. So let's go over that one in a little more detail.
So paragraph 2, you will find the information on the tax printout or also on your MLS printout. And it's very clear, the lot and the block. The addition is the same thing as a subdivision.
Yep.
Okay. And then the county is the county the property is located in. And then you actually get to put the address in with the zip code.
There you go.
Sometimes you have a rural property that has meets and bounds or doesn't have a block but has a lot, or vice versa. So you just fill in what you have on the tax records.
Okay, perfect. And it's important to know that where it just says Texas known as, that is not the legal description. And if you only put that on there, it's not really valid.
It's not a valid contract.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so where it says improvements, tell me a little more about that.
All right, so improvements are anything that's considered permanently installed.
Okay.
So if they put a nail in the wall or a screw in the wall, it could be conceived as permanently installed. That does include things that people typically want to take, like satellite dishes. It could also include gas logs.
Okay.
Draperies, granny chandelier hanging in the dining room.
Exactly.
Or anything that appears to be part of the property that appears to be attached. A lot of people will exempt their drapes, but that does not include the rods and the hardware. The rods and the hardware have to stay unless they're also exempt.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that just because you've taken a listing and in your listing agreement you've put that that's an exemption, it must make it on this as well. Because you and your seller have agreed that that's going to be exempt, but the buyer has no knowledge of what is actually in that listing agreement.
Correct.
So it's important to actually put it on here under exclusions if one of the things mentioned above in B or C is staying with the property. So speaking of C, accessories, what are some accessories?
So that's where you get into the draperies and the rods, the pool equipment. You know, if there's a pool there and you want all the equipment and everything, the contract provides for that. If the seller wants to take any of it, that it would need to be listed as an exclusion.
Yeah, so make sure that if you have a question about something and you're representing the buyer or you're representing the seller actually, and they want to take it and you kind of have a question about it, make sure that that's something that's mentioned on here. Because you know, a lot of times we end up having to buy stuff like that if we don't address it, and it's no fun to have to buy new gas logs for somebody's fireplace.
No, it is not.
At closing.
No,
Yeah,
not
and
at
it's not cheap
$600. No, it is not. It is not.
Exactly.
And that includes security systems, iRing doorbells, the Ring doorbells that people aren't thinking about now.
Yeah.
And then there's Bing doorbells and Bing cameras. So anytime there's any of that, and if they've hired ADT to come in and actually install all that equipment, it's considered part of the property, but there could be a lease on it or a contract on it, and the seller's responsible for that if the buyer doesn't take it over. And the seller cannot take the equipment without excluding it.
Now keep in mind that just because it doesn't mention solar panels or anything like that in here, that actually would fall under this portion of the contract. And that is something that TREC is actually working on addressing as part of the contract altogether, because there's so many people out there who are being sold these solar panels, but they're really just paying monthly payments on them, so they don't really own them. And the average person lives in a home like 7 years, and most people don't pay those solar panels off for 15.
That is correct.
So you end up having a balance due at closing, and you've got a choice. You can either pay it off at closing, you can pay it off early, or if the buyer can qualify to take over the payments on it and has been approved by the lender for those solar panels, the buyer could theoretically assume
and
that.
because they have to be willing to do it, and
Yep.
they can be expensive.
Yeah.
So Scott, let me ask you a question. What is the one thing that does not go in here under exclusions?
Oh, well, that's a good question. What are you going to tell me?
Mineral rights.
Oh, yeah, mineral rights.
They do not go into this section of the contract
Why?
because they have their own form.
They have their own form.
They have their own form,
Yes.
so they are their own granimal.
And what's the likeliness that you're going to buy a residential piece of property and get the mineral rights?
About 97% not.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's very, very,
Very,
rare.
very
Because
low.
most of the time, if a developer has bought a big old piece of land and the mineral rights were attached to it, that developer is probably going to keep the rights to the minerals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if a seller has ever received any mineral rights, then they are convinced that it's going to be a forever income base and they will want to retain them.
Yeah, so if you have a buyer or a seller who strikes liquid gold in their backyard, it's not theirs.
That's right. That's right.
Unless they're part of that 3%.
That's right.